In lands shaped by conquest and shifting rule, identity can become a battlefield long before any sword is drawn. A name, a garment, a baptism, even a marriage can be treated as a declaration. Under empire, faith often survives quietly in households and villages, while public life demands conformity, silence, and careful restraint. In the early 19th century, under Ottoman authority, the boundaries between Christian and Muslim communities carried real consequences. Suspicion could grow from rumor, and rumor could become accusation. A young man could be judged not by what he believed, but by what others decided he must have been. George of Ioannina, remembered as a new martyr, lived within this tension. His life was marked by poverty, service, and ordinary hopes, yet it ended in public witness. The story that follows moves from quiet labor to a final confession that the authorities could not silence. George was born in 1808 in the village of Surkli, in what is now the region of Grevena in Greece. His parents, Constantine and Vassilo, were poor farmers whose lives depended on hard labor and uncertain harvests. From early childhood, he knew the discipline of work and the fragility of stability. Orphaned while still young, George grew up without the protection of parents or formal education. Loss shaped his youth and narrowed his opportunities. With limited means to remain in his village, he eventually left for Ioannina, seeking livelihood within a city governed by Ottoman authority. In Ioannina, he entered the service of Turks and found employment within the Turkish army as a groom and stable hand. His tasks were practical and demanding, centered on the care of horses and maintenance of equipment. The work required endurance rather than recognition. Within this environment, he was given the name Jauer Hasen, a designation implying infidel. The title reflected how he was perceived within a system that measured identity through religious classification. Even his name became part of the tension surrounding his place in society. George's demeanor remained modest and restrained. He continued to wear the traditional long faustanola of his native region, along with an embroidered waistcoat. His clothing reflected continuity with his village roots and with the Christian culture that had shaped him. Daily life in the stables exposed him to scrutiny. Serving in a Muslim military context required careful navigation of expectations and assumptions. Suspicion could attach itself to the smallest gesture, and difference was easily interpreted as defiance. Despite the pressures surrounding him, George did not conceal his Christian identity. His faith was not expressed through confrontation, but through quiet consistency. Those who observed him saw a young man steady in conduct and respectful in speech. The years in service formed his endurance and prepared him for trials he did not foresee. What appeared to be ordinary labor within a rigid hierarchy was shaping a conscience that would later face direct interrogation. From orphan child to servant within the Ottoman army, George's path unfolded without privilege or protection. Yet beneath the surface of hardship, a firm sense of belonging to Christ was already taking root, awaiting the moment when it would be publicly tested. A new chapter in George's life began when he became engaged to Eleni, a Christian young woman from Ioannina. Their union was rooted in shared faith and ordinary hope for stability. In a city marked by division, marriage carried both personal meaning and public visibility. They were married on the feast day of St. Demetrius, a detail remembered by those who later recounted his life. The celebration followed Orthodox tradition, affirming openly the Christian identity George had never denied. What for them was joy would soon provoke scrutiny. In December 1837, their son was born and given the name John. On January 7, 1838, The child was baptized according to the Orthodox rite. The baptism publicly confirmed the family's faith within a society attentive to religious boundaries. These events stirred suspicion among some Ottoman Turks who had assumed George to be a Muslim by association with military service. The clarity of his Christian life challenged that assumption. What had once been tolerated quietly now attracted attention. Accusations began to circulate that George had abandoned Islam. The claim rested not on conversion, but on perception. In a system where identity was often assigned, rather than freely acknowledged, such accusations carried grave implications. The authorities viewed his marriage and the baptism of his son as signs of apostasy. Under Ottoman law, renouncing Islam could be punished severely. The suspicion hardened into formal persecution, and George was summoned to answer for his faith. Interrogation followed swiftly. He was pressed to clarify his religious status and urged to accept the identity imposed upon him. The demand sought public submission rather than private explanation. George responded without hesitation. He maintained that he had never been a Turk and had never embraced Islam. His faith in Christ had not changed, and he refused to accept an identity that contradicted his conscience. The quiet stability of his family life had drawn the line that authorities now demanded he erase. Marriage and baptism had transformed suspicion into confrontation. The young husband and father stood at the threshold of a trial that would determine the course of his remaining days. George was brought before Ottoman officials and questioned directly about his religious identity. The inquiry focused on a single demand, that he acknowledge himself as a Muslim who had strayed and now returned openly to Islam. The pressure sought to force clarity through fear. He answered calmly and without evasion. George insisted that he had never been a Turk and had never embraced Islam. His life, he declared, had always been rooted in the Christian faith received from his parents and preserved through years of quiet endurance. The officials interpreted his words as stubborn defiance. They pressed him repeatedly to accept the identity imposed upon him, offering relief from punishment in exchange for compliance. The demand was framed as a return rather than a conversion. George did not alter his testimony. His refusal was steady and unadorned, expressed without insult or anger. Each repetition of his confession sharpened the resolve of his interrogators to break it. Torture followed interrogation. Physical suffering was introduced as a means of persuasion, intended to weaken both body and will. Witnesses later recalled the severity of his ordeal and the composure he maintained under pain. During these trials, he repeated a simple declaration: "I was never a Turk. I was always a Christian." The words cut through accusation and clarified his position beyond dispute. His identity stood anchored in baptism rather than in political classification. The authorities sought to extract even a single concession that could be presented as submission. None was given. The more they pressed, the clearer his allegiance became. His steadfastness unsettled those who expected fear to produce surrender. A young, stable hand, orphaned and uneducated, now confronted officials with a conviction that did not bend under threat. With persuasion exhausted and torture failing to achieve recantation, the sentence moved toward its inevitable conclusion. The confrontation would no longer unfold in chambers of questioning. It would be carried into public view. The interrogations intensified as officials sought to force a public renunciation. George was subjected to renewed torture, each attempt designed to extract submission through exhaustion and pain. The proceedings were no longer investigative. They aimed at humiliation and collapse. Even under increasing severity, he refused to alter his confession. Those who witnessed the ordeal observed not defiance marked by rage, but endurance marked by clarity. His identity did not shift with circumstance. The authorities repeated their demand that he acknowledge himself as a Muslim and abandon the Christian faith. Relief from punishment was offered as incentive. Compliance would have restored him to favor within the system that now condemned him. George answered with the same consistency he had shown from the beginning. His words remained simple and unwavering. The repetition of his confession only strengthened the determination of his persecutors to end the matter decisively. A formal sentence was pronounced. George was condemned to death by hanging. The gallows would serve as the public stage upon which his loyalty would be tested one final time. News of the sentence spread quickly through Ioannina. Christians gathered in quiet grief, aware of the danger of open demonstration. Even before the execution, many began to regard him as a witness for Christ. The day of execution arrived under watchful eyes. Soldiers escorted him toward the place prepared for hanging. The path that had begun in a poor village and passed through stables and courtrooms now led toward a visible end. Those present expected fear or last-minute compromise. Officials prepared to ask again the question that had defined the trial. The final exchange would determine how his life would be remembered. Standing before the gallows, George awaited the last interrogation. The young husband and father, once dismissed as insignificant, now faced a moment that would bind his name to confession and martyrdom. Before the gallows, the officials asked their final question. The same demand repeated throughout his ordeal. What are you? The inquiry was direct and public, intended to extract submission in the final moments before death. George requested that his hands be untied. The request was granted, perhaps in expectation of a gesture of surrender. Instead, freed from restraint, he lifted his hands deliberately. In full view of the gathered crowd, he made the sign of the cross. The gesture spoke before his voice did, declaring openly the faith he had refused to deny under torture. Then he answered with words that would endure beyond the scaffold. I am a Christian, and I shall die a Christian. I bow before my Christ and my Lady Theotokos. The confession was clear, complete, and without hesitation. No further questioning followed. The sentence was carried out, and George was hanged on January 17, 1838. His final act had transformed the place of execution into a site of witness. Those who observed the scene remembered not panic, but composure. The young man who had endured interrogation and pain now faced death with the same steadiness that had marked his trial. For 3 days, his body was left hanging from the gallows. The display was intended to discourage others from similar defiance. Instead, it deepened the impression of sanctity among the faithful. Christians watched from a distance, praying quietly and awaiting permission to recover his remains. Even some among the Turks were moved by the firmness of his confession. The gallows, meant to silence his voice, preserved it in memory. The words spoken before death became the measure by which his life would be remembered. For 3 days, George's body remained suspended from the gallows, exposed to the elements and to public view. The intention was to prolong humiliation beyond death. The city of Ioannina lived under the weight of that visible warning. When the body was finally taken down, observers noted that decay had not begun. The preservation was unexpected and widely discussed. Even among some Turks, the event stirred reflection about the young man they had condemned. Permission was granted for burial, and George was laid to rest with honor. The dignity denied in life was restored in death. The faithful approached his grave with reverence, shaped by gratitude and sorrow. Many had already begun to regard him as a saint during the days of his torture. His endurance and final confession had impressed themselves upon the conscience of the city. Devotion grew quickly and spread beyond private circles. Soon after his martyrdom, requests were made to the ecumenical patriarchate for formal recognition. The memory of his witness required no embellishment. It rested upon public events witnessed by many. On September 19, 1839, the Holy Synod of the Patriarchate of Constantinople officially glorified George of Ioannina as a new martyr. His commemoration was set on January 17th, shared with St. Anthony, in a manner that would not provoke further tension under Ottoman authority. Only days after his execution, on January 30th, 1838, the first icon of the newly martyred saint was painted. It was commissioned by hieromonk Chrysanthos Lenos, his spiritual father and guide, who had accompanied him through confession and trial. The icon depicted George in his traditional fastanella and embroidered waistcoat, holding a cross in his right hand and a scroll in his left. The image preserved not only his likeness, but the clarity of his final confession. From village orphan to public martyr, George of Ioannina left behind no written treatise and no extended ministry. His witness consisted of a single, unwavering declaration that continues to echo wherever faith is tested by accusation and fear. The life of George of Ioannina reveals how identity can be tested in the most public and unforgiving way. A stable hand without education or position stood before authority and defined himself with clarity. His confession did not arise from argument or ambition, but from a faith rooted in baptism and carried faithfully into the final hour. If stories like this strengthen your understanding of courage shaped by conviction, you are warmly invited to subscribe to the channel. By doing so, you help preserve the memory of those whose lives continue to illuminate the cost and the dignity of remaining faithful under pressure.